Welcome back to my advanced SEO course on schema. Hi, my name is Joseph Kahn, and this is part 2 where we're going to be talking about entities and the semantic web. What is the semantic web? You may have heard of this term, probably LSI or latent semantic index, that kind of thing. What are entities? We're going to talk about that. You're like, what is this entity thing? We're going to basically dive down deep into that, and we're going to look at how all this applies to SEO. And then coming up, of course, we're going to create entities and we're going to implement this on your web pages. So what is the semantic web? First off, the web started kind of as just content is king and content. And the semantic web started building on this idea of entities or concepts of nouns that have other intrinsic data that goes along with it. And that's kind of what you see, these little balls, and there's names for this. We're going to get into that. But basically, in reality, everything that's associated with the data around the web, and there's lots of different names from Web 3.0 to the giant global graph, things like that. But everything around this is about making and helping Google's job to get better, to be able to collect and connect all the data together. And that's why they need our help for this. So what is the semantic web? What is semantics? So the essential meaning of semantics essentially is just the meaning of words and phrases. Okay, so that's all we're trying to do, is just connect the meanings of the words and phrases. So the semantic web is a web of linked data, nothing more, nothing less. It's adding meanings to documents and making everything machine readable. And we're using this Google NLP API. This is fun to play with. If you look up Google NLP API, type that in, you'll see that you can bring up this demo. Now, in the demo, you can put all kinds of code in here. I'm just using this example. My name is Joseph Kahn. I'm the president of HumJam and manage client SEO strategy. If I just put that in, it recognizes entities right off the bat. It comes in here and it says, oh, we recognize this word president. Is this a person? Now, you recognize it doesn't say president of HumJam. You see Joseph Kahn, it has a Wikipedia article. That's because you can mention and connect. And HumJam consumer good, that's incorrect. Clients, it says person, client SEO strategy, other, name other. It's finding these different things, but it doesn't technically know what these entities are. It just recognizes them. So this is the Google natural language processor. And basically it's a pre-trained machine learning model that looks at all different kinds of things. So it uses data points to identify known entities, now public, places, figures, that kind of thing. So, but it also does a sentiment analysis, so it detects whether you're positive, negative, any of that kind of thing. And it also does a sentiment analysis, or it basically determines the emotions towards a detective entity in the text. So a sentiment analysis on the writer's attitude, and then an entity sentiment analysis, which is the emotion of the writer towards the entity. Okay, we'll get into that. And then content classification, which determines a content category for the text. And then a syntactic, I know this is a crazy word, but syntactic analysis, which breaks up the text in a series of words and gives further relationships on their data. So Google NLP kind of breaks up all the words on the page. And this is just a copy from our web page to see what Google would find. And these are all the entities that it found from our web page directly from humjam.com. And as you can see, there's some things. So you see engagement digital, it says as a person, I don't know why. But salience means that this is the higher, it thinks that this is more about what this is about. So it's thinking that our page is more about team. And SEO has that up there high, has copywriting, search engine, over here on the left, and then, more on here to the left. It's basically taking a look and taking a stab to see what are all the entities on my page. And that's and some of these are known, some of these are unknown. The other, that shouldn't say other, but that's what we use schema for, is so that Google recognizes all the entities. So what is an entity to Google? And this is their own definition, is a thing or concept that is singular, unique, well-defined, and distinguishable. Okay, this is an entity. So this is technically a noun, basically. It's a thing or object that can be referred to. That's an entity. So that's what we want to do and use structured data for, is to describe the entity in detail. So it's not just Joseph Kahn. There's lots of things that go with Joseph Kahn, from my education to my certifications to companies I'm involved with to different things. So we want to make sure that we connect all this up so that Google knows. And so a commonly accepted definition of an entity as follows: is an entity is an object or concept in the real world that can be distinctly identified. And basically, it can be registered in a GMB, for a movie database, Wikipedia, etc. That's kind of how we identify entities. So what is an entity to a human? Okay, that's to Google. An entity for a human is we just want to know what it is. That's why entities generally we see in knowledge graphs. We want to see a well-defined concept or thing. And unlike a keyword, which is ultimately just a connection of letters, entities actually have a whole set of keywords associated with them. Like the person of me is not just one sentence, as we saw in the original example. There's a whole bunch of information about who I am that's included in my entity, okay? And it is an entity if it qualifies for a wiki page, okay? So if it qualifies for a wiki page, it's definitely going to be what you call an entity. So what's the purpose for it? And the purpose is to satisfy the user's need for information. That's what the knowledge graphs are. We want to know, we want to be able to trust any of the entities. We want to understand it. We want to see what it's about. So it's to satisfy that user's information need. So Google wants to collect this in their library so that they can provide some expertise, authority, and trust. They want to know that that article that was written about elephants, that the person who wrote it was connected in the entity, had some expertise about it because it connected a certification, that kind of thing. So Google uses this to connect the library into this EAT scoring system also to determine the internal relationships and to create knowledge bases around this. Now, the purpose is to help, and I love this word, disambiguate the terms you're talking about. It helps machines to process large amounts of data and make sure that it's not talking about the same thing. So here's that big word, and I love this word. Use it in a sentence tomorrow if you can. Basically, disambiguate is to remove uncertainty from the meaning of a phrase. Okay, so and here's kind of a big example when it comes to search engines. Alpine. So Alpine, if you what do you think of when you think of Alpine? You know, so I think of Alpine stereo systems because when I was younger, I had an Alpine stereo system. But in reality, from an entity perspective, without this knowledge card down there in Google, Alpine may lose to the actual Alpine entity, which is the Alps. That's where this comes from. So you want to be able to kind of define this and get some knowledge so that if your brand is something like this, that you actually get some representation. Here's another example. Here's kind of something that I deal with. Bugs Bunny paintings. This is a recent thing that we worked on. And Bugs Bunny paintings, as you can see, bugs as an entity is totally not related to bunnies as an entity, totally not related to paintings as an entity, and we're trying to hit Bugs Bunny paintings. And so we want to develop the relationship so that, and as you see, there's a structured data of the actual painting appearing right in Google itself. And we just so happen to got a #1 listing from that, but we actually included the entity data of it so it could relate the Bugs Bunny and the paintings all together to be delivered in a way that shows up right here on Google. So here's the types of entities. They're named like real world objects like Bugs Bunny, okay, denoted by a proper noun. Or they're concepts like peace, like gravity, like wealth, like happiness. These are concepts. These also are entities as well. No, the advantages of entities for Google is so that Google can understand the meaning of the content that's published. You're giving extra meaning to the content that's not distracting the reader of your content. I mean, the reader wouldn't want to know all these extra connections while they're reading the article, but they would like to see for more information or like to see it in some other context searches. So to establish connections between pages, that's the advantage. To understand the requests of the users, and Google will reformulate it in a knowledge graph, in a context card, in a table, and extra data will do that. Or to map areas of interest to improve search results and content suggestions. And let's talk about these differences. The difference between keywords and entities. As an SEO or a digital marketer, you're probably really focused on keywords. And hopefully I'm going to change your mind to focus a little bit more on the entities, because the entities have a whole depth of topical relevance to them if you can focus them and identify them. So keywords are phrases. They're singular phrases like long tail, you've heard of that, entered into the search area on Google, and that's what a keyword is. It's limited to that phrase. Now, an entity has all the concepts that go along with the entity, not just a singular phrase. So that's why it's very powerful to focus. So when the focus is on this entity card, this is basically all the facts about the entity. And again, you're going to want to create entity cards about your entities, whether it's a business or yourself or your articles. You want to gather your prices, the information, whether you're open or closed, that's to build this entity card, and we'll start interjecting this into our code so Google can pick it up. Now, this is kind of the framework, okay? I know this is heady, and this is like, you don't really have to implement this part of it, but this is to kind of give you a mental structure of how it is. So nodes are entities, so like here you see a website, a service, a blog, these are all entities. Then edges are basically those relationships, okay? And they're like publisher, so a website has an organization attached to it, so that's the publisher of the website. A service is the organization provides the service. So, and again, this is so we're thinking when we're writing code or putting schema on our page, we want to make sure to include the correct entities on our pages. So like a post or a blog could be our bio. So us, our bio. An image is also an entity that's included in the bio that could be connected to the author in the post. And so that's why we want to look at kind of this schema framework and be thinking about this from a logical perspective. Okay, so when we think about entities, we look at it in this we take a step back and see, like, your entity could be your web page, your Google My Business page, or Google Business page, different things like that. That's your entity. And then this universe of known entities could include your college, could include a Facebook, a Twitter, different things, people posting about you on another guest post, that kind of thing. That's the universe of known entities. And these are called nodes, edges, and graphs. And the nodes are basically the entities, the edges are these relationships, and the graph is the whole universe, like your particular universe or the universe of, say, a particular category. So that's what this means. How do you determine the entity? The NLP algorithm will run through that, and it determines and it detects people's, places, things, that kind of thing. Off-page factors can determine the entity, basically anything that's pointing to and making sure that it's understanding what that page is, like a map or a Wikipedia page or something like that. And then on-page factors is basically the markup that you put on your page that we're going to show you how to do. We're going to cover this in part 4, using abouts and mentions. So when you have kind of an entity that you want to connect to your page, you can connect it through abouts and mentions that we'll cover on part 4. So things you can do to prepare right now is to gather as much detail about your entities as possible, identify all the nodes and edges and graphs in your universe, check to determine if you have a Google Knowledge Graph. Just put in your entity name and see if anything pops up. And with that said, next up in part 3, how to be the entity. If you don't have a knowledge graph and you want to be a knowledge graph, we're going to talk about how to be the entity, how to get your business registered, how to create the personality, associate your website, etc. We're going to talk about that in part 3. So see you next up in part 3, and super excited to be covering how to be the entity.